The Subcommittee on Research and Technology and Oversight will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittees at any time. Good afternoon. Our apologies for the delay. As you saw or heard, we were voting. Welcome to today's hearing entitled, Is the OPM Data Breach the Tip of the Iceberg? In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Just over a month ago, the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, announced a massive data breach that exposed the personal information of over 4 million current and former federal employees and contractors. Like thousands of my fellow constituents and people across the country, I received a letter from OPM informing me that my personal information may have been compromised or stolen by criminals who are behind this attack. Unfortunately, the news appears to be getting worse this week as we learn more about the reported second OPM data breach, compromising the security of potentially 18 million federal employees, contractors, and others who submitted sensitive information for background checks to the government. And sadly, the response from OPM has not inspired confidence over the past few weeks. Identity theft by what seems to be a foreign entity is a very serious national security threat. They are literally, at cyber war with us, and we as leaders have to appreciate that reality and operate in that reality. Many of my constituents have contacted me about their fears and concerns. It has been months since OPM discovered the attack, and we still have too many questions and not enough answers. As we will hear from some of our witnesses today, federal employees have many unanswered questions. For example, just one. Are the credit monitoring identity theft provisions adequate? I know we've heard from people who are very concerned about whether they are. Most alarming to me about these breaches is that they were launched less than 18 months after a previous severe network assault on OPM. We know that information security incidents reported by federal agencies has increased by 1,000% since 2006. 1,000% increase. For years, the OPM Office of Inspector General and the U.S. Government Accountability Office have been warning OPM leadership of critical vulnerabilities to their information systems. Some of the weakness and current problems were ID'd as far back as 2007. Today, many of their recommendations for fixing the systematic failures remain unmet. Cyber criminals and foreign enemies are working night and day with the latest technology to exploit every vulnerability in our system, and it appears we're behind the times. The United States has some of the world's best technological minds and resources, yet our management and OPM does not appear to be getting up to speed. Federal employees provide their sensitive personal information under the expectation that it is protected with all the seriousness that it should receive. However, that trust has now been broken, and hence so many concerns. Cybersecurity has to be a top priority in every government agency, from the top cabinet official on down. We need an aggressive, nimble, and flexible strategy to anticipate, intercept, and stop these cyber attacks. Those who are engaging in the attacks on our citizens, agencies, and companies, whether they be nation states, adversaries, or hacktivists and just random criminals, are a reality that we will be living with in the 21st century, and we must develop and use all the tools and technology available to thwart them and understand this is going to be an ongoing problem that we have to constantly adapt to. I want to note that we invited the OPM Chief Information Officer, Donna Seymour, to testify at today's hearing. She declined the committee's invitation, citing other commitments, and we will continue to be working with them and asking them additional questions. Today's panel of witnesses will help us better understand the magnitude of cybersecurity challenges at OPM across the federal government, as well as determine what steps need to be taken to prevent future cyber attacks and the state-of-the-art best practices to do so. And I should note that in the coming weeks we will also be looking at a lot of the best practices that the private sector has and other experts want to bring to bear that will probably reflect a lot of what you are going to be talking about today. I appreciate the leadership of Chairman Lamar Smith on these issues and the role of the Science Committee that they have played in making cybersecurity research and development a priority. I look forward to continuing to work in the subcommittee on efforts to make sure the federal government is staying ahead of our adversaries. And if officials have neglected their duties or are not the right people for the job, we also need to hold them accountable and make sure we are doing everything to improve the situation. So with that, I will yield to the ranking member, but I also ask unanimous consent to place into the record various letters and articles that are relevant to the hearing. And without objection, I'll now yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairwoman Comstock. I want to thank you, Chairman Loudermilk, Chairman Smith, for holding this hearing on the recent OPM data breach. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here this afternoon. Unfortunately, major cyber attacks are happening more frequently. Today, we're going to talk about significant breaches at the Office of Personnel Management. I have not received notification, but I believe I may have been a victim of this. But we all know that I don't want to take away the significance of it, but it's important to note there have been an increasing number of cyber attacks in both the private and public sector, where I know I've definitely been a victim of some of these attacks. Several years ago, I began working on cybersecurity legislation, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act, with my colleague, Mr. McCall. Our legislation dealt with cybersecurity standards, education, and workforce development. When we started, I said they had no doubt that threats from individual hackers, criminal syndicates, and even other governments would grow and evolve along with our increased use of the Internet. Unfortunately, I was right. In February, Anthem, one of the nation's largest health insurance companies, announced it suffered a cyber breach that compromised the records of 80 million current and former customers. And just last year, there were high-profile breaches at J.P. Morgan Chase, eBay, Target, and many others, affecting millions of people. Although I was happy that my bill with Mr. McCall was enacted at the end of last Congress, there is much, much more to do in the area of cybersecurity. Cybercrime and cyber espionage continue to threaten our national security, our critical infrastructure, businesses of all sizes, and every single American. This latest data breach at OPM is just another example of that. In the OPM breach, millions of federal employees' personal information has been compromised, leading to significant concerns about how the stolen information will be used. Additionally, since OPM conducts more than 90% of all security clearance background investigations, this breach is an example of how cyber attacks threaten our national security, and we must do better. It will take a collective effort on both the public and private sector to improve cybersecurity, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of research into the social and behavioral aspects in this area. Our IT infrastructure is built, operated, and maintained by humans, from the average worker at our desktop to the chief information officer of a major company or agency. Most cyber attacks are successful because of human error, such as unwittingly opening a malicious email or allowing one's credentials to be compromised. Understanding the human element is necessary to combat threats and reduce risks. To set government-wide guidelines for protecting federal information security systems, Congress passed, if I can turn my page, an example of human error here. Congress passed the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or FISMA. FISMA, which was updated at the end of last Congress, requires federal agencies to develop, document, and implement an agency-wide information security program. Along with being responsible for their own information security system, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is tasked with developing standards and guidelines for all civilian federal information systems. Since NIST plays a critical role in protecting our nation's information security systems, it is important that they be part of this conversation. I'm happy that Dr. Romine is here today to tell us more about how NIST develops FISMA standards and how they work with other federal agencies. FISMA also requires annual reviews of individual agencies' information security programs, as well as reviews of information security policies and the implementation of FISMA requirements government-wide. I hope to hear from our witnesses about the steps necessary to ensure that OPM meets FISMA requirements, as well as how other agencies are doing in this space. More information security systems, both in the public and private sector, will surely be subject to cyber attacks in the future. And while it's impossible to completely protect a connected information security system, we must do all we can to protect the personal information of millions of Americans and conduct the oversight to ensure such steps are taken. This hearing is the beginning of a conversation on how we can do that, and we must make sure that we follow through with action. I look forward to our discussion this afternoon. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Lipinski. And I now recognize the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Comstock, for holding this very important hearing on an issue that hits close to home for you as many as others in this country. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today in order to help us understand what seems to be an epidemic of cyber attacks. I look forward to discussing what needs need to be done to prevent similar attacks from occurring in the future. Now, it isn't a priority, nor it should be a priority for us just to address this because it affects some of us that are up here, but it's because it affects the American people. And unfortunately, this administration has failed to provide Americans with any level of confidence that it will adequately protect their personal information when trusted with it. As we have witnessed over the past few months, there has been a concerning pattern of security breaches involving government computer systems. This includes a recent massive data breach of the Office of Personnel Management disclosing personal and official information that could potentially harm our national security. For an administration that touts that it has, quote, prioritized the cybersecurity of federal departments and agencies, we have instead witnessed a government that is unable to properly secure its computer systems and protect sensitive information. The situation at OPM is exactly why the subcommittee that I chair is looking into the collection of Americans' personal data through the healthcare.gov website. In that situation, it appears that Social Security numbers, dates of birth, names, mailing addresses, phone numbers, financial accounts information, military status, employment status, passport numbers, and taxpayer IDs are being retained. This information is being stored in a data warehouse that is intended to provide reporting and performance metrics related to the federal facilitated marketplace and other healthcare.gov related systems. In the situation of the data warehouse, the administration never appeared to be forthright about the use and storage of personally identifiable information on healthcare.gov. The administration has yet to explain the reason for indefinitely storing user information, particularly of the users of the website who input their data to log in but do not end up enrolling. While this administration has claimed that cybersecurity is a priority, their actions on this and other issues regarding protecting the American people suggest the priorities are only lip service. From ending the Secure Cities program to storing critical information on American citizens without their approval or knowledge, this administration is proving through their actions that protecting the American people is far from being on their list of priorities. If that data warehouse is being protected in the same way that OPM was protecting personal information, action needs to be taken now to avoid putting the American people at significant personal risk. With many Americans being forced into the government healthcare exchange, a breach of this system could end up having millions affected, just like the OPM data hack. The Government Accountability Office has included the cybersecurity of federal information systems on its list of high-risk areas since 1997, so this isn't something new. Why then are we sitting here almost 20 years later wondering why our federal information systems are not being adequately secured? In the most recent GAO high-risk series report, it says that inspectors general at 22 of the 24 agencies cited information security as a major management challenge for their agency. For fiscal year 2014, most of the agencies had information security weaknesses in the majority of 5 key control categories. As chairman of this committee's Oversight Subcommittee, I want to find the truth behind this reckless behavior that is threatening the safety and security of the American people. These actions, or rather lack of action, puts the future of our nation at great risk and must stop. I look forward to today's hearing, which I anticipate will inform us more about the recent OPM breach and the current state of our federal information systems. We owe it to the American people to ensure that their personally identifiable information is safe and protected from cyber criminals. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Loudermilk, and I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, the gentleman from Virginia, my colleague, Mr. Byer, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairs Comstock and Loudermilk, for holding this hearing today. Incredibly timely. And because earlier today, obviously, New York Stock Exchange, United Airlines, the Wall Street Journal, all suffering from computer glitches that has disrupted their computer networks. And whether this turns out to be intentional or whether or not, it certainly highlights the potential vulnerabilities of our digital dependence. And today's hearing, obviously, is about Office of Personnel Management. Deterring, detecting, and defending against the multitude of online threats that constantly lurk in the cyberspace domain is a critical issue for federal agencies and the federal government, private sector alike. Last year alone, federal agencies reported nearly 70,000 individual computer security incidents to the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or CERT. During the same time period, October 1, 2013 to September 30, 2014, non-federal entities reported more than 570,000 incidents, and many other incidents are potentially not identified or even not reported at all. Cyber threats are constant, they're evolving, they're very sophisticated, and many pose serious distress to companies, agencies, and individuals. The two recent data breaches at OPM are particularly important to me and to my constituents. Representing a congressional district just outside the nation's capital, many of my constituents are federal employees who may have had their personal data compromised as a result of these intrusions. One of those attacks is believed to have compromised the personal information of more than 4 million people, and the other up to 14 million people. And I'm particularly troubled that the data that was reportedly accessed included not just the personnel files, but the security files of our defense, homeland security, and intelligence community employees. This could potentially jeopardize the financial security, personal safety, and ultimately the secrets that are entrusted to help protect the nation. While the facts of this case are still being unraveled, including the motive for the attack, the identity of the perpetrators, and the potential damage they may have caused, we should understand, too, that the federal government is not alone in being the victim of cyber attacks. In the past year, hundreds of millions of personal records have been compromised by hackers targeting J.P. Morgan, Chase, eBay, Home Depot, Target, and other private companies. I seem to receive a new credit card or debit card about every 6 weeks from my bank with a note telling me that the card has been compromised yet again. When I was in Switzerland, its State Department computer was hacked in 1 year, the Defense Department the next. The newspapers blamed China and Russia. Still, the OPM was significant, and I'm particularly concerned about the impact this has on the morale of a federal workforce that has recently endured, through no fault of their own, a government shutdown, forced furloughs, staffing cuts, pay freezes. These government employees now have the added insult of a breach of their personal data. Agency heads should also be mindful and accommodating of the impacted federal employees who need time off to mitigate the fallout from this hack. And I encourage OPM to communicate with all agencies to ensure that workers are accommodated so they can visit their banks, Social Security offices, creditors, in order to deal with the repercussions of the breach. I know every time I get a new card, I get 4 or 5 people that don't get paid because the card number's changed, and then they call, and I know it upsets my wife terribly. I'm also concerned that the reports of this attack suggest it may have been the result of individuals with ties to foreign entities, and that particularly a private company working for the government as a security contractor may have been the weak link in the chain of events that led to the successful attack. We're making steady, slow progress in fortifying our cyber defenses from potential attack. According to OMB's annual report on FISMA, sent to Congress in February, there's been improvement in federal agencies implementing continuous monitoring of their networks and the authentication of their users, for instance. But these results are not good enough. I know everyone on the panel here is interested in learning what we can do to strengthen the system as quickly as possible, as strongly as possible, recognizing that we're never going to have 100% security, that the creative hackers, ever younger, will figure out additional ways around it. How can we create the very best advice on closing cybersecurity holes if and when they exist, and then augmenting our security defenses against them? So I very much look forward to your testimony and your advice. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
And thank you for your leadership on this, too, and being up front on it. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's hearing highlights the latest and so far the most extensive cybersecurity failure by a federal agency, the theft of millions of federal employee records from the Office of Personnel Management. National defense in our digital age no longer just means protecting ourselves against enemies who attack with traditional weapons. It now means protecting America from those who launch cyber attacks against our computers and networks, invading our privacy and probably endangering lives. But it is about much more than solely the invasion of privacy or the burden to our economy. This is a national security concern, as these breaches expose information about members of our military and employees of national security agencies. A number of federal agencies guard America's cybersecurity interest. Several are under the jurisdiction of the Science Committee. These include the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate, and the Department of Energy. All of these agencies support critical research and development to promote cybersecurity and set federal standards. However, it is clear that too many federal agencies like OPM fail to meet the basic standards of information security, and no one is being held accountable. Last year, audits revealed that 19 of 24 major federal agencies failed to meet the basic cybersecurity standards mandated by law, and yet the administration has allowed deficient systems to stay online. What are the consequences when a federal agency fails to meet its basic duties to protect sensitive information? So far, it seems the only people penalized are the millions of innocent Americans who have had their personal information exposed. It will be some time before we know the full extent of the damage to personal and national security caused by the OPM breach of security. But we do know that it is critical that we prevent further attacks on America's cyber systems. The federal government failed in its responsibility to keep sensitive and personal information secure, and Americans deserve better. The Science Committee will continue its efforts to support the research and development essential to strengthen our nation's cyber defenses. We will also continue to demand better answers from OPM on the extent of this breach. The director of the Office of Personnel Management recently testified, quote, "I don't believe anyone at OPM is personally responsible," end quote. That is not believable. In fact, it's an insult to the American people who pay her salary. The government should be accountable to the people, and this committee will continue to demand answers about who is responsible for failing to keep America's sensitive information secure. I hope we can use lessons learned from the OPM breach to help find solutions to prevent the next attack. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Now at this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Michael Esser is the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the Office of Personnel Management. In this role, Mr. Esser is responsible for overseeing audits of OPM's information systems. Prior to joining the office in 1991, he worked in Northern Virginia as a CPA. Mr. Esser holds a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting and a master's degree in business administration from George Mason University. Our second witness today is David Snell, Director of the Federal Benefits Service Department for the National Active and Retired Federal Employee Association, which represents some 300,000 active and retired federal employees and their spouses. Before joining there, Mr. Snell worked for nearly 3 decades at OPM, ending his career there as Chief of Retirement Benefits Branch. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from George Mason University. We have a theme here. Great university. Our third witness today is Dr. Charles Romine, Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This program develops and disseminates standards for security and reliability of information systems, including cybersecurity standards and guidelines for federal agencies like OPM. Dr. Romine has previously served as a Senior Policy Analyst at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and as a Program Manager at the Department of Energy's Advanced Scientific Computing Research Office. Dr. Romine received his bachelor's degree in mathematics and his PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Virginia. Today's final witness is Dr. Gregory, I get this right, Wilshusen. Okay. Mr. Wilshusen is the Director of Information Security Issues at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Prior to joining GAO in 1997, Mr. Wilshisen was a senior systems analyst at the Department of Education. He received his bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Missouri, I guess the non-Virginia University here, and his Master of Science in Information Management from George Washington University. Close enough. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. I now recognize Mr. Esser for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairwoman, Chairman, ranking members, and members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Michael Esser, and I'm the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's hearing on the IT security work done by my office at OPM. OPM has a long history of systemic failures to properly manage its IT infrastructure, which may have ultimately led to the recent data breaches. We are pleased to see that the agency is taking steps to improve its IT security posture, but many challenges still lay ahead. To begin, I would like to discuss some of the findings from our annual audits under the Federal Information Security Management Act, known as FISMA. We have identified 3 general areas of concern, which are discussed in detail in my written testimony. The first area is information security governance. This is the management structure and processes that form the foundation of a successful security program. It is vital to have a centralized governance structure. OPM has made improvements in this area, but is still working to recover from years of decentralization. The second area is security assessments and authorizations. This is a comprehensive assessment of each IT system to ensure that it meets the applicable security standards before allowing the system to operate. Our 2014 FISMA audit found that 11 of OPM's 47 major systems were operating without a valid authorization. Because of actions taken by the CIO in April 2015, we expect this number to more than double by the end of fiscal year 2016. The third area is technical security controls. OPM has implemented a variety of controls to make the agency's IT systems more secure. However, these tools must be used properly and must cover the entire IT environment. Our FISMA audit last year found that they were not. These areas represent fundamental weaknesses in OPM's IT security program that have been reported to the OPM Director, OMB, and the Congress for many years. The fact that these long-standing issues were allowed to continue for so long without being taken seriously raises questions about the inherent effectiveness of the original FISMA legislation and implementing guidelines. Since 2002, IGs have been reviewing their agency's information security programs, but the reporting guidelines from OMB were focused on compliance with specific security areas and lacked perspective on the overall effectiveness of the agency's program. The FISMA Modernization Act of 2014 shifts the focus from reviewing compliance to assessing effectiveness of security controls. In addition, a new maturity model approach to evaluating the state of agencies' continuous monitoring programs was introduced in this year's FISMA reporting instructions for OIGs. These new developments should go a long way toward improving the IT security programs of federal agencies. OMB and DHS should also work toward making the OIG FISMA reporting metrics more reflective of the current risks and threats, and further adopting the maturity model approach for other reporting domains. I would also like to take a moment to discuss EQIP, the IT system that OPM uses to collect information related to federal background investigations. Just last week, OPM disabled the system due to serious vulnerabilities detected in the design of the database and public-facing website. While we agree with the actions taken, OPM has known about vulnerabilities in this system for years, but has not corrected them. During the 2012 security assessment and authorization process for EQIP, an independent assessor identified 18 security vulnerabilities, which still remain open and unaddressed today. We believe this is an example of the importance of the security assessment process and also of OPM's historical negligence of IT security in general. Moving forward, OPM is undertaking a massive infrastructure improvement project, which, when completed, should significantly improve the agency's IT security posture. However, we identified several concerns related to OPM's failure to follow proper project management processes and the agency's use of a sole source contract. These are discussed in more detail in my written testimony. We fully support OPM's modernization efforts, but we are concerned that if this project is not done correctly, the agency will be in a worse situation than it is today, and millions of taxpayer dollars will have been wasted. Thank you for your time, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And I now recognize Mr. Snell for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to testify. I appreciate the opportunity to express NARF's views regarding the recent data breaches at the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. We are deeply concerned over the failure of the federal government to protect its personnel computer systems and the devastating impact the recent breaches of these systems may have on national security, as well as on the financial and personal security of millions of current and former federal employees. Let me be clear, the potential consequences of these breaches are severe. The personal records obtained through the data breaches include the highly personal and sensitive information of millions of current and former employees and even applicants for federal employment. The extent of the breaches is enormous, likely reaching beyond 18 million individuals. Possession of the information contained in the Standard Form 86, a 120-page security clearance form containing an applicant's life history, could give our enemies the means to attempt to corrupt or blackmail government employees and compromise military and intelligence secrets. Moreover, it could make public servants vulnerable to grave risks to their personal security and that of their families and loved ones. While the perpetrators of this act bear the obvious and primary fault in this matter, the federal government, including both the administration and Congress, has an obligation to do its best to protect the sensitive information its employees and job applicants are required to disclose as a condition of employment. It failed to meet that obligation. Despite explicit warnings by inspectors general since 1997, OPM failed to put in place adequate safeguards for both its aged and newer computer systems. This permitted the theft of massive amounts of personally identifiable information. Even now, the current OPM Inspector General issued a flash audit of OPM's plans to improve its data security and found them to have, quote, a very high risk of project failure, unquote. Our government has failed its employees. It is imperative to act swiftly and ensure an incident of this magnitude does not repeat itself. The congressional oversight and response, including this hearing, is a good start. But we need continued vigilant efforts to improve the federal government's information technology and data security for the future. The federal government, including both the administration and Congress, now has an obligation to remedy, to the best of its ability, what has transpired. This should have started with effective communication with federal employees, retirees, and others affected by the breaches, and the organizations that represent them. Unfortunately, communications has fallen short of expectations. While OPM has provided notice to those affected by the breach announced June 4th and has communicated with organizations in that regard, it has thus far failed in its basic duty to inform individuals affected by the second and more troubling breach announced June 12th, and continues to fail to answer many important questions about both breaches. The failure of OPM to safeguard personal information should not be compounded by deflecting questions. Our written testimony details many of the questions we are still seeking answers to regarding the details of exactly what data has been accessed. The federal community and everyone affected by the data has been data breach deserves answers to these questions. In addition to better communication, the federal government should provide lifetime credit monitoring and additional identity theft insurance. The 18 months of credit monitoring offered by OPM is woefully inadequate. The depth of personal information exposed is enormous, and the threat to individuals extends way beyond 18 months. It is only fair to provide financial protection in line with the threat that has been posed. Furthermore, Congress should appropriate funds necessary to provide this protection. The question posed in the title of this hearing, is this the tip of the iceberg, is a valid one. While I cannot answer that, I will say I certainly hope not. The recent breaches should be a wake-up call to this country and its leaders about the dangers of cyber terrorism and the critical need to protect our government's core functions. Let's make sure this isn't the tip of the iceberg, but rather the last time our federal government has to deal with cybersecurity breach that threatens the financial security of its employees. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our views.
Thank you, Mr. Snell. And now, Dr. Romine, for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairwoman Comstock, Chairman Loudermilk, Ranking Member Lipinski, Ranking Member Beyer, and members of the subcommittees, I'm Dr. Charles Romine, Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at NIST. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our responsibilities for assisting federal agencies with cybersecurity. NIST has worked in cybersecurity with federal agencies, industry, and academia since 1972. Our role to research, develop, and deploy information security standards and technology to protect information systems against threats to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and services was strengthened through the Computer Security Act of 1987, broadened through the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002, or FISMA, and reaffirmed in the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014. NIST carries out its responsibilities under FISMA through the creation of a series of Federal Information Processing Standards, or FIPS, and associated guidelines. Under FISMA, agencies are required to implement those FIPS. To further assist agencies, NIST provides management, operational, and technical security guidelines covering a broad range of cybersecurity topics. NIST has a series of specific responsibilities in FISMA. Two of particular relevance to today's hearing were addressed by NIST and published as FIPS 199, the standard for security categorization of federal information and information systems, and FIPS 200, which sets the minimum security requirements based on the categorization identified using FIPS 199. NIST created baselines for these minimum security requirements based on 3 levels determined in accordance with FIPS 199, low, moderate, and high. For example, at a high categorization, FIPS 199 states that, quote, the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability could be expected to have a severe or catastrophic adverse effect on organizational operations, organizational assets, or individuals, close quote. Examples of controls included in the associated baselines then cover a range of requirements for a life cycle of security. For example, security awareness and training, contingency planning, access control, system disposal, and incident response. Once a baseline is established, NIST provides guidance to agencies to assist in determining that the baseline is adequate to meet their risk-based requirements. An agency may need to enhance a given baseline to address local risks, the agency's mission, and technical infrastructure. For example, an agency with a real-time monitoring system such as workstations in air traffic control or critical patient monitoring systems might not want to use a timed password-locked screensaver to mitigate security issues for unattended workstations. Instead, a guard or site surveillance system might be more appropriate to support the mission and still meet the intent of the baseline. Establishing a sound security baseline is not the end of security for an agency. NIST provides standards, guidelines, and tools for agencies to test and assess their security and continuously monitor their implementation and new risks. The authorization of a system by a management official is an important quality control under FISMA. By authorizing a system, the manager formally assumes responsibility for operating a system at an acceptable level of risk to the agency operations or individuals. Under FISMA, NIST does not assess, audit, or test agency security implementations. Congress recognized that placing such responsibilities on NIST would impede its ability to work with federal agency and private sector stakeholders to develop standards, guidelines, and practices in the open, transparent, and collaborative manner that Congress intended. NIST's statutory role as the developer, but not the enforcer, of standards and guidelines under FISMA has ensured NIST's ongoing ability to engage freely and positively with federal agencies on the implementation challenges and issues they experience in using these standards and guidelines. NIST is committed to continue to help agency officials address their responsibilities under FISMA to understand and mitigate risks to their information and information systems that could adversely affect their missions. We recognize that we have an essential responsibility in cybersecurity and in helping industry, consumers, and government to counter cybersecurity threats. Active collaboration within the public sector and between the public and private sectors is the only way to effectively meet this challenge, leveraging each participant's roles, responsibilities, and capabilities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on NIST's work in federal cybersecurity, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Doctor. And I now recognize Mr. Wilshusen for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Comstock, Chairman Loudermilk, Ranking Members Lipinski and Beyer, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. The recent OPM data breaches affected millions of federal employees. However, OPM is by no means the only agency to suffer data breaches or face challenges securing its computer systems and information. The number of information security incidents, both cyber and non-cyber, reported by federal agencies continues to rise, increasing from about 5,500 in fiscal year 2006 to over 67,000 in fiscal year 2014. Similarly, the number of incidents involving personally identifiable information more than doubled in recent years to over 27,000 in fiscal year 2014. These incidents illustrates the need for stronger information security controls across the federal government. Today, I will discuss several cyber threats to federal systems, cybersecurity challenges facing federal agencies, and government-wide initiatives aimed at improving cybersecurity. Before I begin, if I may, I'd like to recognize members of my team who are instrumental in developing my statement and some of the work underpinning it. With me today is Larry Crosswood, an assistant director who led this body of work. I also want to recognize Brad Becker, Lee McCracken, Chris Brzezinski, Scott Pettis, who also made significant contributions. Madam Chairwoman, Mr. Chairman, the federal government faces an array of cyber-based threats to its computer networks and systems. These threats include both targeted and untargeted attacks from a variety of sources, including criminal groups, hackers, disgruntled insiders, and foreign nations. These sources vary in terms of their capabilities, willingness to act, and motives, which can include seeking monetary gain or pursuing an economic, political, or economic advantage. In the grip of these threats, most federal agencies face challenges securing their systems and networks. Agencies continue to have shortcomings in assessing risks, developing and implementing security controls, and monitoring results. For example, 19 of 24 agencies covered by the Chief Financial Officers Act reported that information security weaknesses were either a significant deficiency or material weakness for financial reporting purposes. And the inspectors general at 23 of these agencies cited information security as a major management challenge for their agency. Agencies also need to provide better oversight of the security of their contractor-operated systems. 5 of 6 agencies we reviewed did not consistently assess their contractors' information security practices and controls, resulting in security lapses. Even with effective controls, security incidents and data breaches can still occur. Agencies need to react swiftly and appropriately when they do. However, 7 agencies we reviewed had not consistently implemented key operational practices for responding to data breaches involving personal information. GAO and agency IGs have made hundreds of recommendations to assist agencies in addressing these and other challenges. Implementing these recommendations will help strengthen agencies' ability to protect their systems and information. DHS and the Office of Management and Budget have also launched several government-wide initiatives to enhance cybersecurity. One such initiative is requiring stronger authentication of users through the use of personal identity verification, or PIV cards. However, OMB recently reported that only 41% of agency user accounts at 23 civilian agencies required PIV cards for accessing agency systems. Another initiative, the National Cybersecurity Protection System, is intended to detect and prevent malicious network traffic from entering federal civilian networks. GAO is presently reviewing the implementation of this system. Our preliminary observations indicate that the system's intrusion detection and prevention capabilities may be useful, but are also limited. While government-wide initiatives hold promise for bolstering the federal cybersecurity posture, no single technology or set of practices is sufficient to protect against all cyber threats. A multi-layered defense-in-depth strategy that includes well-trained personnel, effective and consistently applied processes, and appropriate technologies is needed to better manage cyber risks. This concludes my oral statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony and for your expertise and work on this over quite a long time. I would like to remind members that the committee rules limit our questioning to 5 minutes, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on questions. In a Washington Post editorial from this past Sunday, July 5th, they said, the OPM director knew as well as anyone how sensitive the data was, yet the door to her agency was apparently left ajar. Thieves walked out with an intelligence gold mine. This was an unforgivable failure of stewardship that should lead to firings for incompetence. Mr. Esser, to your knowledge, has OPM reprimanded or fired any official over this failure to protect its employees' most sensitive data?
I'm not aware of any.
Or are you aware of any discussions to that effect?
No, I haven't heard any.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Snell, really thank you for being here and representing so many people, not just here in our metropolitan area, but all across the country, because this impacts our contractors, our federal employees. So it's important for people to understand that this is really a nationwide breach, and you're representing people who are aware of this, but there's still many more that aren't. Could you tell us what some of their concerns and unanswered questions are, and how you think additional things that might be helpful for the employees, and from what you've heard, that we might ask for to help answer the questions that you've been getting from people?
Thank you. I'd be glad to. A lot of the folks we hear from, our members as well as others, their main concern is trust, and trust in what they get. The information came to many of them through email. The email address was not a government email address. It was a .com address. They didn't know whether to open it. They didn't know what to do with it. They had little information. Many people received letters. Those people don't have internet. They weren't able to access the frequently asked questions and the explanations that the Office of Personnel Management had available out there, and so they were left in the dark. They didn't know if they called a number, if they contacted anybody, if they could ever trust them. So we have a lot of distrust out there. A lot of folks are scared, obviously. They don't know what's going to happen. Some folks who have not been notified that their records were compromised are wondering, were my records compromised? Can I trust the fact that I didn't get notice, or is this another, problem? So those are the questions, those are the concerns that we hear from our members, both current federal employees and retirees.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on identifying any of those and how we can help answer their questions. I was wondering, Ray, a question for all of you. What kind of things, if someone has had their information breached or compromised, what should they be on the lookout for now? What would be an unusual type of situation that should raise the antenna and say, this might be something I need to pay attention to? Can you think of some scenarios just so that people can get an idea of what they have to be on the lookout for?
Sure, I'll start it off. First of all, individuals who believe their information may have been compromised or have been notified that it has been should certainly check their credit reports to see if there have been any new credit accounts or charges that they're unaware of that may have propped up, and certainly that's probably one of the basic things that individuals should do. They should also know that they are entitled to receive a free credit report from each of the 3 credit reporting agencies on an annual basis. And that's something that one should do on a regular basis annually, is to check each credit reports from each of those organizations. Indeed, if they do receive the letter, as I have, is to also check to see about subscribing to the service that OPM is offering through their contractor, because they too will provide, or are supposed to provide anyway, some surveillance on the part of the individual.
I would add to that, and those are excellent suggestions. I would add to that any statement they get regarding any other benefits they get from any other company or government entity such as Social Security, if there's something that has changed without their knowledge, they should report that right away. We had one member who found out his address on his Social Security payments had changed without his authorization. Being this close to the events of the breaches, of course, that member was concerned that this had been connected, but we did report it to OPM. The OPM folks had looked into it and decided that it was a separate incident, but still, any kind of changes like that, people should look into.
Okay. And one other thing I was wondering, a lot of people don't know what's necessarily in their personnel file. Have people asked you about possibly having copies of their personnel file, having copies of your background check? Because, if something starts coming up, you don't necessarily know what's in your background check, right? Or even your personnel file, even though you fill it out. Particularly with the background checks, those people aren't going to have any idea what people have said, right?
Right. We haven't heard from anybody, any of our members, with that particular request. So.
Okay. Thank you. And I'll now turn over to questions for Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you. I want to get down to the big question and what, in terms of what we should do moving forward here. It's not acceptable for these data breaches to occur at OPM, anywhere else in the government or in the private sector. We know, we know that they can happen, but I sometimes feel like there's not enough done, not just in the public sector, but the private sector to prevent these. So my question is, how do we make FSMA effective? I understand, as Dr. Romine said, that NIST, for good reason, only sets the standards. They're not the enforcer. So who should be, who can be the enforcer when it comes to the federal government? I want to try to figure this out so that we can get someone, so we know who's accountable, who can be held accountable, and who has the responsibility. So, Mr. Esser, what would you recommend?
Well, one possibility is OMB. I mean, we, as an IG office, we audit, we report, and we identify, areas of weakness, but that's as far as our authority extends. We have no enforcement authority. Those reports go eventually to OMB, and that could potentially be one area of enforcement.
Dr. Romine, do you have any recommendations?
Oh, I think that's right. The oversight function, as it currently is set up under FSMA, I think is a OMB with more recently DHS providing assistance to agencies to meet their obligations under FSMA. So I think that's the right answer.
Mr. Wilshusen, do you have any?
Yeah, I would agree to the same extent that both of the other witnesses mentioned. But I would also just like to point out that under law, both under the FSMA of 2002 and FSMA of 2014, it is clearly the responsibility of the head of each agency to implement the appropriate information security protections to reduce the risk and magnitude of harm that could occur should information or information systems be compromised through unauthorized access, use, disclosure, modification, destruction, and disruption. And so clearly, in terms of responsibility, it's the head of each agency head to make that happen.
Is there anything more that you recommend that we do? As you said, FSMA has been updated, but is there anything more that should be done with, that Congress should do with FSMA? Does anyone have any recommendations for anything further?
Well, I would just say first that I think Congress went quite a distance in terms of modernizing FSMA to include clarifying the roles and responsibilities for information security across the federal government, particularly with assigning responsibilities to the Department of Homeland Security, who has now responsibility for assisting and overseeing, to an extent, implementation of security controls at the federal agencies. It also recognizes the need for new types of security controls and procedures to be put in place, such as continuous monitoring, continuous diagnostics, and mitigation, which is another type of control set that, if effectively implemented, could assist agencies in better protecting their systems, identifying their risk, and addressing the key vulnerabilities first.
Okay. Mr. Esser, did you want to add something?
Sure. I agree with Mr. Wilshusen, and I think from our viewpoint, the FSMA Modernization Act of 2014 went a long ways towards improving the situation, changing our reviews from more of a compliance check of a yes or no, do they have or do they do security controls testing, to an effectiveness test of how good are those tests, and moving towards continuous monitoring and the mature model that is being put in place. So we think continuing to move along that path is the right direction.
Anyone else have anything to add? Good. All right. Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Wilshusen, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the situation we have at OPM is exactly why my subcommittee is investigating collection of America's personal data through healthcare.gov. In September 2014, the GAO came out with a report noting that healthcare.gov's data warehouse system, MIDAS, did not have an approved privacy impact assessment that included a thorough analysis of privacy risks. Given that MIDAS is processing personally identifiable information and appears to have indefinitely storing that information, how important is it to have an approved privacy impact statement or assessment for MIDAS?
I think it's vitally important, because in that it helps the agencies to identify not only the privacy risks associated with that particular system, but also alternatives and the controls that should be in place to better protect and help protect that information.
Thank you.
And we also noted that not only had CMS not effectively implemented or designed a policy impact assessment for MIDAS, but for other systems connected with healthcare.gov.
Do you know if an assessment is done since the September report?
We just received information we actually made a recommendation that in their privacy impact assessments that they assess these privacy risks, and to date we believe that recommendation is still open and not been fully implemented.
They have not. Is that concerning?
Well, we believe they should do that, yes.
Okay. When you looked into the MIDAS system as part of the healthcare.gov review, was it known to you that personal identifiable information of individuals who signed up on the healthcare.gov website would be indefinitely stored?
It was known that initially the CMS officials indicated that personally identifiable information may not be stored in it, but then they acknowledged that it would be. And it was because of that acknowledgement that personally identifiable information would be stored in MIDAS that the need for assessing those privacy risks is important as part of a privacy impact assessment.
Okay, so the fact that they indicated that they intended to store this PII information is really what catapulted this assessment, the need for the assessment. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Any new development or system should have a privacy impact assessment if personally identifiable information is going to be collected, stored, or disseminated through that system.
Is it normal for the federal government to store PII information on websites or information obtained through websites?
I would say that it is normal for agencies to store personally identifiable information, some of which may be obtained through a website. But I have not looked at that specifically with regard to collection of information through websites.
Okay, I appreciate that. Also, GAO has listed the security of our federal cyber assets on its high-risk list since 1997. It's been almost 20 years. Does it remain on the high-risk list to this day because of evolving threats to federal information systems, or is it because federal agencies have not been able to learn how to properly protect these systems?
I would say both.
Okay.
Okay, because certainly there's an inherent risk to agency systems because of the evolving threats and just the complexity of the systems that agencies develop and operate, because much of the software that agencies use have vulnerabilities in it. Some discovered, some undiscovered. But at the same time, it's incumbent upon federal agencies to implement the appropriate security controls to mitigate those risks at a cost-effective and acceptable level. And we found that agencies have not consistently implemented agency-wide information security programs to mitigate that risk effectively.
Is it because of it's a lack of priority for a lot of these agencies?
In some cases it might be, but it's also in other cases, I believe, it's just to the fact that there are a number of actions that agencies just haven't really taken that they need to take, such as installing patches on a timely manner and assuring that known vulnerabilities are remediated in a timely manner.
Can you tell me who's ultimately accountable for the cybersecurity of our federal government?
Accountable or responsible? You know, I have to say, in terms of, at least for federal agencies, the agency head is responsible for implementing effective security controls, and that's under law, under FISMA. At the same time, in terms of accountable, that's harder to measure because, to my knowledge, it's difficult to see what accountability mechanisms are in place to assure that individuals are effectively securing systems. That could be done through personnel performance expectations, but in terms of individuals being held to account for that is somewhat uncertain.
I see I'm out of time. One quick question, if I may, Madam Chair.
Okay, we're just tight because we're going to have votes. We want to squeeze everything.
On a scale, grading like elementary school, A to F, our federal cybersecurity, how do you grade it?
D.
D minus, from the way I hear that?
I'll go with D because in many respects there are improvements within federal information security and some of the initiatives, but it's getting to the effective implementation of those security controls and some of the initiatives over time, consistently, that's been proved challenging.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panel.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Snell, do you know how long it takes to have a negative report, a so-called derogatory report on your credit report drop off? Okay, well, 6 to 8 years. I want to bring that up because it's a long time.
It is a long time.
And I want to call attention to something that you mentioned in your written report where you say, quote, the federal government should offer identity theft insurance, should offer credit monitoring services for the lifetime of anyone affected, and increase the amount of identity theft insurance provided in certain circumstances. Unlimited coverage may be required. I just want all of us to highlight that because this is, I think, a really initiative that we can bring as Democrats and as Republicans on oversight to this issue.
Well, thank you.
So thank you for bringing that up. Because, by the way, the other rhetorical question is, do you know how long it gets them to fix something that's wrong in a credit report, which is like impossible.
Yeah.
So,
it's a nightmare. I know.
yeah, thanks. Mr. Esser, I was, your testimony was pretty devastating. All the things that didn't get fixed that were identified year in and year out within OPM, and I'm just baffled by it. Do you have any idea why? Is this a series of CIOs who didn't respond? Is it a series of directors, Democratic and Republican administrations that didn't respond? Does any of it come back to us on Congress because we didn't allocate the resources necessary, the hardware, the software, the staffing to make all this happen? For example, you mentioned in there that OPM has decided they needed a legacy system, that with legacy systems you couldn't go back and tinker with them one by one. You had to do an overhaul. Help us understand this lack of leadership and lack of action on something that you guys as Attorney General, Inspector Generals had clearly identified.
I would have to guess it's a combination of factors. Certainly there's been, different directors and different CIOs during the time period that we've reported material weaknesses in IT security. If you look at the current director, she wasn't there when this all started. Current CIO wasn't there when this all started. But at the same time, there's been current issues that we've reported that, they also haven't gotten addressed in the timely fashion that we would like to see them addressed. Resources, I think, is always an issue. But it's not the sole answer. I think sometimes we feel like things that we report don't get the attention that they should get. We've had weaknesses that have been outstanding for years and years and years, and that just shouldn't be.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Esser. Dr. Romine, did I say that right? On NPR this morning, they were talking about the difficulty that our military and our intelligence units are having with ISIS encrypting messages between their potential recruits. Can we use this encryption for federal government data?
I don't know what encryption they're using, but we do have access to strong encryption. And in fact, NIST and my laboratory has been in the encryption space for decades now, starting with the original DES. Data encryption standard that was developed through NIST. We've certainly recognized our guidance provides input that encryption is a very powerful tool for securing information. It's not the only one in the arsenal, but it is a very effective one and often not very costly. And so I think certainly it's an avenue for protecting the data.
I know you're not responsible for the private sector, and it seems that you clearly have developed some very thoughtful guidelines and protocols for how the federal government should work. Do you have any sense of whether the federal government leads or lags the private sector in terms of cybersecurity, data encryption, all the things we're talking about today?
So I think there are bright spots in both cases. I mean, I think it's uneven in the private sector just as it's uneven in the federal government as well. I will say that the guidelines and the standards that we issue that are principally intended for the federal government are often picked up by the private sector because of the quality of those guidelines and standards. And in fact, we depend on the private sector to participate and provide us with input. We have a multi-phase comment period for almost all of our guidelines so that we get the best minds in the private sector and public sector to contribute.
Yes, thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Cybersecurity and the kind of attack that we saw on OPM, I think, and I believe I read it here somewhere earlier today, is just the tip of the iceberg. As a 30-year IT professional myself, I firmly understand that as long as computers are working off of ones and zeros, the bad guys are going to be out there trying to get in. And the battle space is huge. and our ability to protect it is going to require constant vigilance. It's not a problem that has it's not a race that has a finish line, because as soon as we get to one point, the goalposts are moved and the game strategy changes. And I spend a lot of my time helping to educate and inform those that will listen, so that we understand that this is a big issue, and communications and computing technologies are foundational to our economy and to virtually every industry that supports our economy, including our own national security. So it's a really big issue. Mr. Esser, the OPM director has stated that some of OPM's network systems are so old that it has been difficult, if not impossible, to upgrade and encrypt them. How credible is that explanation, and how many of the OPM systems that were hacked were these old legacy systems versus more modern ones capable of encryptions and upgrades?
I don't have an exact count of how many are legacy systems and how many are modern. There is a lot of credibility to what she says. There are old systems at OPM that it is difficult to bring into the modern era of security. Not that it can't be done, but it can be difficult. But our understanding is that at least a few of the systems that were hacked are more modern systems that certainly, modern encryption techniques and other security techniques could have been implemented on.
Right. Okay. Well, a complete overhaul of the existing IT infrastructure at OPM could take years, right? Do you believe that there are intermediate steps OPM could take to address security needs in the short term?
There are, and they have taken some of those steps. They've
What are those? Can you enumerate some of them?
Well, when the initial breach took place in 2014 and they began working on tightening up their systems, they went into what they call a tactical phase of immediately remediating some of the high security problems they had. And so we're fully in favor of everything they've done related to that. Things like, requiring more two-factor authentication. They're not fully there, but they're working on it. So they have taken steps to tighten up systems in that respect.
Okay. Dr. Romine and Mr. Wilheisen, do I have that right?
Close enough. It's Will Schusen.
Will Schusen. Okay. I apologize. Johnson's pretty easy for everybody, so I don't ever have that problem. Sorry. Dr. Romine and Mr. Will Schusen, do you agree? Are there things that can be done in the near term? Are there more things that can be done in the near term?
Well, certainly from the perspective of the NIST guidelines and FISMA guidelines that we issue, I think we put those out as a means of reducing the susceptibility of the system to hack. Nothing is 100% secure, but I think following those guidelines is the most effective way that I can think of to protect the systems.
Mr. Will Schusen.
And I would agree with both what Dr. Romine and Mr. Esser said. One thing that comes to mind too is based on what's been reported by the Office of Management and Budget as it relates to OPM, is that as of the end of fiscal year 2014, OPM had only implemented the use of personal identity verification cards or strong authentication for 1% of its user accounts. My understanding is that they're making progress now to improve that, but certainly having strong authentication using multi-factor authentication for user accounts would be one area that it seems that OPM could improve on, and may be working on that now.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, and I've exhausted my time. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And I recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to the chairs and ranking members for this important conversation, and thanks to the witnesses who are here. I wish we each had 5 hours instead of 5 minutes, because there's so many questions. So I wanted to start, Mr. Snell, you mentioned the issues and the challenges with notification and communication, and this is something that I want to recognize both in the public and private sector has been a challenge, and of course with the number of current and former federal employees. It's my understanding that the FSMA requirement requires notice to affected individuals provided as expeditiously as practicable and without unreasonable delay. So those are obviously terms that are not concrete depending on the circumstances. I just bring this up to recognize the importance of communicating with people who are victims of the data breaches, and it's not just an issue in the federal arena either, in the private sector as well. I want to go back to the point that was made about encryption. It's my understanding that Estonia, even though it's a small country, had a significant data breach in 2007 and has really come around and is now considered one of the countries that does the best job of protecting data. And granted, it's a much smaller population, but they do make heavy use of encryption, and they also have focused on educating a workforce. And I also serve on the Education Committee, and I wanted to ask about whether we are really educating people who will be able to be the people who are preventing as well as understanding how we need to do this both psychologically and technically. So do we need to improve cybersecurity education? Are there enough opportunities for the workforce? Do we have the people we need out there to be able to do these jobs? I'll start with Mr. Wilshusen.
Well, I think certainly improving the cybersecurity understanding and awareness on the part of the public at large, which I believe you're referring to, as well as with the federal workforce, is going to be very important to address the cyber threats that consistently evolve and are becoming more sophisticated over time. And certainly having an awareness of that and what types of controls and activities one should engage in and should not engage in should be certainly on the minds and done of everyone, because each individual potentially could be the weak link in which results in some sort of a computer compromise.
That's a great point. And in your testimony, you have this whole chart about the common adversaries and you list hackers. And I have to say, I'm a little confused I go visit schools, and the high schools are having these hackathons, and they're considered positive things. So is hacker a negative connotation, or is it a positive? Or is it depends on who the hacker is? It's a little confusing.
I guess it depends on what they're doing with their hacking. You know, if they're so-called white hat hackers, but in terms of it's good to know how hackers, and particularly those individuals with malicious intent, operate, what types of tools they use, how their modus operandi, if you will, in order to understand how to protect against them. And so it's important to know that, and certainly one of the things that information security professionals do is penetration testing, and to see whether or not an organization's information security controls are effective in keeping out hackers who may use similar type of techniques.
Terrific. And I wanted to ask, I guess each of you, can you talk a little bit about what are your 2 or 3 top recommendations for improving practices generally, not necessarily just for the federal government? Mr. Esser? What would be your top 2 or 3 recommendations?
I mean, one of the things I would go back to is the two-factor authentication to strengthen security. It's really necessary to implement that, and not just that, but I mean, there's all kinds of different things that need to be implemented, and the key, I think, is having, security in defense in depth, I think, is the term that's used.
Terrific. And I want to make sure the others get it, and I'm almost out of time. Mr. Snell, do you have a couple of
No, that's not my strength, so I'll...
Communication. Dr. Romine?
Sure. I would echo. I think that proper identity management is a key driver. I think it can be really beneficial. Good use of encryption is good for preserving the integrity or at least the confidentiality of data. So I would just maybe add those two.
And Mr. Welshison.
I would say one is addressing patches or installing critical patches and remediating known vulnerabilities. U.S. CERT recently came out with a technical alert that said if you address these top 30 targeted vulnerabilities, that would address up to 85% of the targeted vulnerabilities that are currently being used. The other thing would be improved detection and prevention capabilities, because regardless of how well you protect your systems, it's likely you still may be subject to attack from unknown vulnerabilities.
Thank you so much. I see my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just take privilege to note, I know when I was visiting schools that also do the hacking and training them, that it's a great growth area for kids to get engaged in and get educated on, because there's going to be lots of jobs for them in this area. And I know somebody who works in the business, so they tell their clients, if we can't hack into your system, you shouldn't hire us to protect your system, because that's part of what their job is, to constantly be looking for the next attack, right? So that's, well, thank you. I now recognize Mr. Abraham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess first I'll express my disappointment for the Chief Information Officer, Ms. Seymour Knight, are declining our invitation to come speak here. It's my understanding that she has extensive involvement in repairing the system. Might I suggest that if OPM had put extensive involvement in preventing this, we may not even be having this hearing. So just that as a statement. Mr. Welshison, I'm going to start with you. Has the federal government's response to this breach, in your opinion, been sufficient?
Well, one of the responses, I can't necessarily speak specifically to OPM, but more broadly speaking, as you may know, the federal CIO issued an initiative or a proclamation known as the 30-day cybersecurity sprint. And indeed, to the extent that that 30-day sprint raises awareness and invigorates activity towards addressing these basic security requirements included in the sprint, such as installing critical patches, assuring deploying multi-factor authentication, and resolving known vulnerabilities, that's important. And to the extent that that gets done, that's a positive. But where it may become detrimental if after this 30 days, which expires on Sunday, by the way, that the agencies and the federal government relaxes and thinks, oh, okay, we've accomplished our goal, I think that's a mistake, because cybersecurity and implementing effective security is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's something that needs to be going on a continuous basis. And the fact of just possibly going back to the status quo, which only led to the conditions that resulted in the need for a 30-day sprint. So I would say it raised awareness. Agencies may be taking actions to improve their security, but that needs to continue in perpetuity.
And I'll follow up with you, Mr. Welshison. Knowing what you know about the cybersecurity or lack thereof of all our federal agencies, would you entrust any of your sensitive information with any of these agencies?
In some cases, I have no choice because my information is at other agencies through security clearances and the like, and through our tax systems and issuing tax returns. And so, yes, I do entrust personal information to agencies, and that's why it's important and incumbent upon those agencies to adequately protect information that the American taxpayers, the American public, entrust to it.
And it's my understanding that the GAO tracks the history of these breaches. How does this OPM recent breach compare, or where does it rank in the history of the other government breaches as far as the tracking is concerned?
Well, in terms of the number of individuals affected by this breach, it's among the top. A few years ago, back I think in 2005, 2006, there was a data breach at the Department of Veterans Affairs in which the hard drive was stolen from an employee's from their home, but that contained the personally identifiable information of 27 million veterans and current service members. But that hard drive was ultimately found and determined not to have been, the information was determined not to have been disclosed. So this particular breach ranks right up near the top, I would say.
Right. Mr. Esther, you said in your testimony that the OPM leadership has not been forthright about the claim of proactively shutting down the EQIP system. Can you tell us how long the OPM has known about these vulnerabilities to that particular one system?
There was a security assessment and authorization done on the EQIP system in September of 2012, which identified 18 vulnerabilities. I do not know if those vulnerabilities are related to the reason that the system was shut down last week, but it certainly indicates that there has been vulnerabilities that OPM has been aware of and has not addressed even to date.
Okay. Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Ms. Esty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you and Chairman Loudermilk and Ranking Members Lipinski and Beyer for holding today's extremely important hearing. And as has already been noted, with 3 other breaches having been noted today in the private sector, it's very much on all of our minds. Our national and personal security depends on a strong cybersecurity infrastructure. And the recent breaches that have been disclosed with OPM are, to me, particularly disturbing when I look at the security clearance records that could have been compromised. No credit check is going to make up for the risk to not just personal security, but our nation's security for every individual who went through or was consulted as part of that system. So I'd like you to think and maybe get back to us on what sort of protection and advice do we give on the national security front, on the security breach aspect, because that is very different than your personal information to raid your bank account. That's a risk of true grave concern for this country, which we haven't really discussed today. It seems to me a number of issues have been raised, and I want to quickly tick them off and then focus on the last. We need to understand the extent of vulnerability, and that's been discussed at some length. The accountability for what's happened also been raised by other members. And I want to focus on the last two, our capacity to address these issues in the future. That's a question in part of resources, and that's been mentioned, both personnel resources, and Representative Bonamici raised an issue. She and I share a grave concern and interest in encouraging young people to pursue these fields and making sure we have enough capacity on both the private sector side and the public sector side. Is it a priority issue? Do we need to have different prioritization? But the last issue I'd really like you to respond to is, how do we move to a continuous monitoring or effectiveness model from what we've had, which is a compliance model? It seems to me we have a real challenge. Congress enacts laws. Laws are about compliance. They are snapshots in time that reflect our knowledge and technical capabilities. But as we've all discussed here today, these are evolving risks, and the moment we stick a pin in the butterfly and pin it down, it will change by the time we finish pushing that pin in. So if you could discuss a little bit, what can we do on the congressional side and what can the agencies do to move to a mindset that is much more nimble and that is in a continuous mode, because that's going to be both what our hardened software look like, but also our mindset about what compliance actually means.
Well, I'll take first stab, if you don't mind. Well, one is an initiative that's already underway within the Department of Homeland Security as it relates to continuous diagnostics and mitigation. The extent to which DHS is providing tools that are available for agencies to implement this capability. Our work at the Department of State before this initiative was established showed that there are benefits to monitoring the security posture of an organization on a continuous basis, but there are also a number of challenges associated with that, some technological, some management, and operational. But certainly that's one area that can be done, and indeed Congress in its in the passage of the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014 recognized the need for continuous monitoring and identified that as one of the areas that agencies should be focusing on in securing their systems. And so that's one part of it. But you're right, I totally agree. The need for assessing and monitoring the effectiveness of security controls needs to be done on a continuous monitoring basis because the threats change every day. The computing environment changes, is very dynamic, and new vulnerabilities are being identified each time.
If I may, I'd like to spotlight two things that NIST is doing that address two of your issues. One is we house the Program Office for the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, which is an interagency activity that I think is making great strides in addressing the workforce issue that you brought up. The second is under Executive Order 13636, NIST engaged the private sector and other stakeholders in a year-long effort to develop what turned into the cybersecurity framework for improving the cybersecurity of critical infrastructures. And although that was the focus, it has turned out that that report that we developed, the framework, is a model, I think, for establishing or improving a cybersecurity approach, whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, or other areas. It's a very dynamic approach that involves, a development of maturity along the lines of analogous to a maturity model, and so I think that could be really beneficial.
Okay. Thank you. No, we just want to be able to squeeze in our last two folks here. Mr. Palmer, recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. We've talked about defense in depth and the hardware, but I want to talk about the individuals involved. Dr. Will Houston, the OPM and Department of Homeland Security officials stated that the attackers who breached OPM systems may have been aided by user credentials that were obtained or stolen from one of OPM's contractors. Andy Osment testified before the Oversight Committee that part of this breach may have occurred through social engineering. I want to know, in your opinion, what agencies can do to ensure that their IT contractors are effectively protecting federal systems and information. I mean, I fully get it that we need to completely overhaul our hardware and software, but that alone, in the context of defense in depth, will not secure the system.
I wholeheartedly agree. You know, the oversight of contractors and their information security practices over systems that they either operate on behalf of the federal government or operate to process information on behalf of the federal government is really critical to assure that agencies need to assure that that information is being adequately protected. And that requires that they go in and assess or have an independent assessor evaluate the security controls and assure that they're being operated effectively and efficiently, and that indeed the requirements for information security are expressed to the contractor either through contractual instruments or other mechanisms to assure that they know what is required to help protect those systems. And another point you raised in terms of was the stolen user credentials that might have been used to help promote or facilitate the attack on OPM. One of the things that could help there is having multi-factor authentication, which would help to either prevent or at least raise the bar significantly for that attacker to be able to use compromised credentials. And that wasn't in place in all places throughout OPM.
Well, it's even worse than that. Dr. Osment wasn't in his testimony, but in an interview talked about the fact that one of the contractors working with OPM was based in Argentina and was working with two people who were Republic of China nationals. I mean, how do we let something like that happen? I mean, with the amount of cyber assaults, I visited a facility that monitors these cyber attacks, and you could literally see them being launched. There were 700 and something cyber attacks launched from Russia within 10 minutes. China was a distant second. How is it that we would not be aware that we had people foreign-based involved in this, and particularly a couple of Chinese nationals?
I guess I'm not familiar with that particular situation, so I don't know if I can really comment to that. But
well, I think you would agree, though, that that's a pretty egregious oversight or failure to exercise oversight over our systems.
I think it's important that agencies understand who has access to their systems and are accessing their systems. And that kind of gets back to the identity management area that the panel spoke about earlier. So that certainly is one specific point to that.
Mr. Snell, I want to ask you something here. Mr. Abraham brought up the fact that Ms. Seymour did not want to testify before this committee. When she testified before the Oversight Committee, I asked her if the breach was limited only to people who had filled out the standard Form 86, the security background check. Because that was, I think, the position that OPM had taken. Turns out that it extends beyond that. Two of my staff who have never filled out an SF-86, who have never served in the executive branch, both got letters telling them that their personal data had been compromised. Do you have an idea of how broad this is? And does it extend to beyond current federal employees to retired employees? Is it possible that it would extend to civilians who have national security clearances?
That's entirely possible. We don't have firsthand information. We only know what's being reported out of OPM, and it's not very much. It's not very helpful what they're reporting as far as numbers, but it's entirely, and it has been, I think, in the media mentioned that it could be contractors as well as federal employees, former employees, people who are no longer in the federal government. So I'd have to turn that back over to the Office of Personnel Management to come forth with information letting us know exactly who the victims of these breaches are.
Madam Chairman, I'll yield the balance of time. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize 5 minutes for Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Being a former federal employee, Mr. Snell, what are the kinds of communication that you would like to see happen?
Well, in a situation like this, I would like to see the communication be sent via letter with OPM agency seal on it, so that the individuals would be able to at least feel confident that this is an official U.S. government notice. And that kind of, I know it's not efficient in today's email world and all of that, but in a case like this where we have the credibility issue as to who do you trust, who do you don't trust, I think a letterhead, OPM letterhead, or an agency letterhead would have gone a lot further to helping folks believe what they're getting is bona fide. So I like that kind of communication.
Thank you. And Mr. Esser, the review here that was done would obviously involve the private sector, right, with contractors serving the federal government with some of the reinforcement here. How was there any review done of that private sector element?
I'm not sure I understand what review you're referring to.
Well, just with the outcome that we had in the situation, were contractors reviewed in this situation that serve the federal agencies?
I'm sorry. I guess I still don't quite understand the question. What review are you referring to?
Just the malfunctioning that occurred as we look over the situation and try to determine where the weaknesses in the system are. What is there a role that the contractors to the system might have played here, or that could have been better collaboration involved in the system? Were there any recommendations that you could make in that regard?
I mean, we in the IG office when we do our reviews, certainly there's contractor-operated systems at OPM, and we look at those the same way we look at the agency-operated systems. I mean, there's a number of contractors that are working at OPM and likely at many other agencies as well. They, I believe, are treated the same way as federal employees in how we conduct our reviews.
And in those reviews, was there a need for better collaboration in this whole process, where there could have been perhaps a stronger partnership with those efforts?
I don't believe we reported any issues in that area.
And to any of you on the panel, when we look at a situation like this, is there a concern for the amount of available resources to an agency to prevent any of this activity? Is it a function of lack of resources, or how those resources have been shared? Would any of you comment on weak investment or falling short in the resources we require?
Broadly speaking, not just talking to OPM, but across the federal government, many of the security control deficiencies and weaknesses that we identified during our audits are more of an information security management process more than a lack of resources in terms of implementing effectively and consistently across an agency its own defined and developed policies and procedures. For example, one basic control is just installing patches on a timely manner, particularly those that have been rated as critical. Agencies often have policies that state, they need to be installed within a certain period of time, usually within a week or a couple weeks. But we find that sometimes those patches are not being installed for months and sometimes over years. So it's a management issue to make sure that these key security control issues and controls are being effectively implemented. There are also resource implications as well. In some cases, it may be important for agencies to implement new technologies or tools, particularly with respect to installing intrusion detection capabilities within their networks to identify those types of vulnerability or cyber attacks or intrusions that do inevitably occur.
Thank you very much. I see my time is out, and
Okay. Thank you. And we do have a vote now. So I just want to thank the witnesses for their very valuable testimony today. Sorry we had to sandwich it in between our votes because I know myself and my colleagues could spend a lot more time talking with you about this and will be talking with you and asking for any guidance that you can give us with your expertise. So we very much appreciate you coming before us. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. And so the witnesses are excused, and we thank you again for your expert testimony, and this hearing is adjourned.